channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is just going to be my October wrap up. So just going to be going through all the books that I read in October, give you my thoughts, my feelings, my ratings, and just a bit of a wrap up on all the books I read that month. So I think overall in October I did have a really good month. I ended up reading 12 books. Most of them were kind of within the 4-star and above range, so for me that's a really good month. Definitely enjoyed most of the reads that I picked up. There was one or two that I was a bit less enamoured with, and I did have one DNF, but I think overall it kind of balanced out to be a really good reading month for me. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get into the wrap up. So the first ones I'm going to go through are the rereads and the DNF I had. So to get the negative out of the way, because as I say, I had a really good reading month, the first book that I want to talk about is The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow, and this one I did DNF, but I do want to stress I do think it's a me problem rather than this book's problem. I've had the same problem with another book that I read by this author, and I just think for some reason I'm not vibing with the books when I'm reading them, and mostly it's to do with the characters. For some reason I don't feel connected to them. But to give you a bit of a synopsis on this one, it's basically centering around the suffragette movement, so around 1893, and a lot of it is kind of discussing the feminist movement and kind of empowering women as well, but it's kind of tied in with a bit of magical realism where essentially in this world there have been no witches for quite some time, or at least any witches or anyone who has magic has been hidden for quite some time because it is dangerous to be a witch. But around this time, and kind of intermingled with the suffragette movement, there's 3 sisters who have been estranged for some time but do have magical powers, who end up coming together and the storylines kind of converge again, and they decide to join the movement, and the story kind of goes from there. And I didn't read enough of it to kind of know exactly where the story goes. I think I ended up around 40% into this, just DNFing it, and it is quite sad because with this author I really love the writing style. I think she has a really lyrical writing style, some beautiful quotes in here, but for some reason when I'm reading the books that I've read by her, so this one and Starling House, I just don't connect with the characters the way I usually do, or the way I usually like to anyway when I'm reading, and it just means that I'm not invested in it when I'm reading it. So for me, it just takes away a lot of that enjoyment. I'm very character driven. I do need a good plot as well, so I'm maybe about 50-50. If there's really good characters, I can kind of let go of the plot a little bit. If there's a really good plot, sometimes I can kind of give a bit of leeway with the characters, but for some reason I just don't connect with the characters that this author writes. I am still going to try and read The 10,000 Doors of January because I do have a physical copy of it, and hoping maybe that's the book for me, but there's just something within this that just doesn't work for me for some reason. I'm really sad about it because, as I say, I love the writing style, but unfortunately this just wasn't one for me. So the next 2 I'm going to talk about, I won't be talking about them for too long because they are part of the Throne of Glass series. So I done the tandem read for Tower of Dawn and Empire of Storms by Sarah J. Maas. As I say, part of Throne of Glass. I think this is books 6 and 7 or something like that. So I can't really give you too much in terms of the synopsis for these ones, but it's the first time I've done the tandem read, which is basically reading certain chapters of each book at the same time. So instead of reading them kind of as you should when they were released chronologically, you read say 4 chapters from this one, then 4 chapters from the other one, and it all kind of meshes into one bigger story. And I definitely say it really did. It flowed really well. I really enjoyed reading it this way, but I would still recommend, if it's the first time reading these books, for me personally, I think reading them separately does make them hit a lot harder. I think while the pacing of this felt really good because the slowness of Tower of Dawn was kind of balanced out with the action-packed scenes that are in Empire of Storms, I do think that the books individually hit a little bit harder when you're reading them separately, especially Tower of Dawn. I do think it's a great story of healing and self-reflection and personal growth, and I don't think it hit quite as well when you were reading it in tandem because you were concentrating on some of those more high-stakes plots that you were getting within Empire of Storms. But if you're doing a reread, it's definitely a good way to kind of reread through these stories. You know what's going to happen. You've already kind of had that emotional payback from Tower of Dawn, so it was a really fun way to reread it and kept it a little bit interesting. So yeah, I mean, these are both 5-star for me. It's a 5-star series. I really love it, so no surprises there. But yeah, in terms of the tandem read, I would definitely highly rate it for a reread, but for the first time reading, I would say still read these ones separately. And then the last reread I done in October was Jane Eyre, and this is by Charlotte Bronte, and this is one of those books that I always say is one of my favourite classics. I absolutely love it, but I haven't actually read it since I was 15, so I wanted to reread it just to see, is it still a book that resonates with me? Do I still enjoy the story? Do I still enjoy the writing? Because I was 15 quite some time ago, so it was really interesting to do a reread of this, and I done a reread with this with my friend Breakfast at Tiffanys on bookstagram, so I'll link her profile below. I linked it it a few times, but we decided to do this reread because we both loved this book. I wanted to see if we still loved it now that we're a little bit older. Now this book is kind of your quintessential Victorian novel, however it does have a bit more of a gothic flair and a bit more of a thriller and suspense flair as well, and that's what I think sets it apart from some of the other classics that I've read. You basically follow Jane Eyre from she's quite young. She becomes an orphan when she's young and ends up in the care of her aunt. And let's just say her life at that early stage is quite traumatic. She's quite mistreated and she ends up going to this school for essentially, I would say, children who don't have parents or kind of children who don't really have a place within society. She goes to this kind of boarding school and to be honest, it's kind of her salvation. You see her forging friendships and relationships with people that she maybe didn't have before. And eventually she graduates from that school and becomes a governess, and that's where she meets Mr. Rochester, who is the main male love interest in this book, and the story kind of goes from there. It is very slice of life. It is very just following Jane's life as it goes along, but there is a little bit of a thriller aspect in there. There's definitely some gothic themes and some more eerie themes within this, so autumn and winter are a perfect time to read this one if you were looking into it, and I can confirm I gave it 5 stars again. Absolutely loved this. I will say, reading it from an older person's perspective, there were some behaviours that Mr. Rochester and some other people around Jane were displaying that maybe when I was young I didn't realise were quite so toxic, and I may have even romanticised when I was younger, so it's definitely interesting to see that from a different light. But in the end, still really loved this one, still really enjoyed the story, loved the writing, and it's definitely one I would reread again. So now that we have the rereads out of the way, I'll go through the first book that I read this month, and it was Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare, and this is the second book in the Dark Artifices series, and I think book maybe 15 within the Shadowhunter world, or no, I think this one's maybe like book 12. There's a lot of books in that series. It's one of the later books within that series anyway. So again, I can't really give you too much of a synopsis on this one, but if you haven't heard of the Shadowhunters world, it's basically an urban fantasy following these people who are known as Shadowhunters. They are basically there to protect humans, or what they call mundanes, from things like vampires, fairies, werewolves, all of those type of things. And essentially we're just following their lives along, kind of the drama that comes along with that. And for me, this is just a really great series, and even though there are so many books, you could think it becomes quite repetitive, but we have kind of urban fantasy within this series, and the Mortal Instruments are set in kind of modern day, or at least modern for the time that it was written, which is kind of the early 2000s, 2010, so modern in that sense. People have phones and things like that. And then we do have 2 of the series are actually set back in time, so one is like kind of Victorian times, Regency era, and then the other one I believe, which is the last trilogy, which I haven't read yet, I believe it's set around the 1920s, so there is a little bit of a historical fantasy element there as well throughout the series, so it doesn't get boring in my personal opinion anyway. But yeah, I read the first book in this one in September, so Lady Midnight, absolutely loved it. 5 stars, and this was exactly the same. I really loved it. I think Cassandra Clare is the queen of writing tension-filled romance, forbidden love, love triangles, anything like that. If you're a big romantasy fan and you were a little bit intimidated about looking at this series because there's so many books in it, it seems like it's much more of a urban fantasy led story rather than kind of a romance led story. I would say that is true. A lot of the story in here is led by the plot and what's happening in and around the characters. However, this one, the character work and the romances and the relationships, absolutely top tier. If you like anything like tension, slow burn, will they, won't they, these are the books that you need to read. There's honestly, within each kind of mini series, within the full series, you'll always have at least 1 or 2 relationships that you're just so invested in, and honestly she gives you crumbs as it goes along, but you're literally dying to get those crumbs as you go along the series. It's really good, really entertaining, and I just love the series so far. So I'm currently reading the last book in this trilogy, and again, it's not disappointing, but that'll be in next month's wrap up once I've actually finished it. But yeah, this is just another sign. If you haven't started the Shadowhunter series and it's one that you've been looking into, definitely pick it up. I would say overall it's a 5-star series. Mortal Instruments is a bit of a choppy start, I will say. Just keep going with it because I just feel like the series have just got better and better as they've gone along. Next up, I read Goldfinch by Raven Kennedy, and this is the 6th book in the Plated Prisoner series, I believe. Yes, the 6th book. This is kind of a King Midas retelling. We start off the story following a character called Oren, who is essentially King Midas's saddle, as they call it, so basically one of his women, and she is the favoured of King Midas, and she's completely made of gold, and a lot of people believe that's because she is the favourite and because she's touched by Midas. And essentially the story kind of goes from there. There's quite a lot lot that happens to kind of open up this world, but it's one of my absolute favourite romantasy series, and I really love Raven Kennedy's writing as well. So I was highly anticipating this last book because it has been quite some time since the previous one came out, so I couldn't wait to get this conclusion. I will say that this one, in terms of the book itself, was probably around a 4-star. I think there wasn't as much action or plot development as I would have liked, and I do think there was a lot of concentration on characters' romances within this that we didn't really necessarily need, but I do think it was because it was rounding out from the previous books. And at the end of this, it was left a little bit open, and I'm hoping that means that there's possibility for some spin-offs for certain characters, because I don't feel like all of the stories were resolved in this. I think Oren's story, who is kind of the main character in the first 6 books, I do think this is kind of a nice conclusion to her story, but for some of the side characters I do think it was left a little bit open for potential spin-offs. I mean, Raven Kennedy hasn't said there's going to be anything like that, but I can live in hope. I think all in all this is still a 5-star series for me. This book in particular was around 4 stars, but the series is still 5-star. This hasn't changed my mind, and yeah, overall I did really enjoy this one. So next up I read My Throat an Open Grave by Tori Bovalino, and this one initially was a complete cover buy, so I'll just bring it up closer so that you can see. It's an absolutely stunning cover, and then I read the back of it and it kind of said it was inspired by The Labyrinth, which is one of my all-time favourite movies. Absolutely love it. I do think David Bowie was probably a very early crush for me because of that movie, and that was me sold. And to be honest, it's quite short, so I thought it was worth giving a try. I will say, in terms of that initial comparison to The Labyrinth, I think other than the initial plot line, it doesn't really compare. Basically the main character is left to look after her baby brother, and essentially within this town there is the Dark Lord, who is kind of revered, and there's kind of lore going around, if you will it, he will take a child from you, and if you go and try and retrieve it, basically the women who have tried to do that have never come back. And other than that initial premise, there's no real comparison here. So if you are expecting it to be fully like The Labyrinth or to give you those vibes, it's not quite that. It's a bit more of just a YA gothic romance. However, it did really deliver on those gothic vibes, so I will give it that. I did think that it delivered that quite well. I do think that it was kind of a very run-of-the-mill YA romance. There were a few cliches in there, but there were also a few twists and turns in here in terms of kind of mystery subplot, which kept me intrigued and kept me interested, and I think were executed quite well. Just in terms of trigger warnings, it does explore kind of religious exploitation and oppression, ideas of suicide, and also kind of emotional abuse from your family, so definitely just check some of those trigger warnings if you're going to delve into this one, because there may be a few things in there that could affect you. But yeah, I think overall this one I did really enjoy it. I enjoyed the writing style. It kept me quite entertained. It was quite a short read, quite atmospheric, and it did get me out of a little bit of a book slump that I was in at the time. So yeah, overall rated this one 4 stars. So next up I read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and again really enjoyed this one. So I absolutely adored The Starless Sea. I read that at the start of this year, so I've been highly anticipating this book, but a lot of people told me that it's definitely one to read around the autumn or winter time, and I'm really glad I did listen to that advice, because I do think this is very atmospheric for this time of year. And in this one we basically follow 2 magicians who have been brought up their whole lives to anticipate basically this duel within this circus. They're not really told what the duel is going to be or when it's going to be or how they're going to have to conduct it. They're just told that they're going to have to kind of showcase their magic, and one of them will win. And I do think in terms of that, I thought we would get a bit more explanation on what that duel was going to be, or what the magic was going to be, or kind of how it was going to be undertaken. And I don't think we really got that. It was kind of a vague exploration of that. So I was a little bit disappointed on that side of things, because I was definitely anticipating kind of a bit more of a explosive end with this one, but it definitely was a bit more of the vibes over plotline, if that makes sense. I do think that yet again Erin Morgenstern's writing was absolutely lyrically beautiful. It really just enraptures you and gets you captivated within the world that she's building. And not only could I really envisage the scenes that she was depicting, I could also smell the smells, you know, like popcorn or candy floss, all those kind of things that you imagine when you're going to a circus or a fair or something like that. I could actually smell the smells of the places that she was describing. So I do think that in terms of the writing style and the world building and the atmosphere building, it's absolutely second to none. Her writing is absolutely stunning. But as I say, it's very much a vibes over plot book. I do think that the pace was extremely slow, and in the middle bit it did kind of lose me a little bit, because there's quite a lot of time jumps within this, and you do have to really concentrate on what you're reading and the kind of time frame that you're reading from, but also there's a lot of vagueness, so you're not really sure where the plot's going or what's going on for some of the book. And The Starless Sea was quite similar, but I do think it kept me a bit more engaged. Even when I didn't understand what was going on, I just wanted to turn the page to kind of figure that out. Whereas with this, it did feel like a little bit of a slog jumping back and forward, and I was very conscious of it. So I do think that that's kind of why it felt a little bit slow for me. However, after around the 65%, 75% mark, I do think that it picked up again because a few things started to click into place, the plotline started to make more sense. But again, it wasn't quite an explosive ending, it was definitely a vibes over plot type of book. I didn't feel like the stakes were ever that high considering kind of what the synopsis is for this one. But I do think overall I really enjoyed it, and I definitely recommend this one if you're looking for a really atmospheric autumnal read. This would be a perfect one to pick up. So I ended up rating this one 4 stars overall. Next up, I read Fishous by V.E. Schwab, and V.E. Schwab is one of those authors that I've only read 1 or 2 books from, but I just know that she's going to be an auto-buy author for me, and one that I really love most of her work. Just her writing style, it just speaks to me, there's just something about it. So I really just want to try and work my way through her backlog. I pretty much have most of them on my TBR at this point, so I'm just trying to actually pick them up and start to read them. So this was the first one I decided to pick up. Again, it's quite a short book, so I thought it would be a good place to start. And in this one, we're following 2 friends in college who essentially are trying to analyse or discover how people end up with extraordinary powers, and they end up finding out that it's related to near-death experiences and decide to try and kind of emulate that within themselves to see if they end up with some magical powers. And at that point, we kind of do a 10-year time jump, and essentially one of them is just coming out of prison. He spent quite a long time in prison, and the 2 of them are no longer friends, and it's kind of exploring where their relationship went wrong, how he ended up in prison, and a lot of it is just kind of exploring the 2 main characters and trying to understand who is the villain. They're both kind of morally grey, they're not really entirely likeable, but you do end up rooting, well I did certainly anyway, rooting for one over the other, and it's kind of left up to the audience or the reader to decide who's the villain and who's the hero in this one. So I thought that was a really unique concept, I really enjoyed that. I think the atmosphere in this one was definitely very eerie and gothic, so again perfect for this time of year. I think if you're a fan of Batman or anything like that, it was definitely giving me kind of Gotham City vibes. So it is kind of centering around superheroes and extraordinaries as they call it in here. So if you are a fan of anything like Batman, this is probably going to be a good one for you to read. I wouldn't say it's the same in terms of the storyline or anything like that, but in terms of those vibes you're getting and the atmosphere, this is definitely very comparable to that one. And this is technically a duology, so there is a second book called Vengeful, but I do think that this one left it off where there's a tiny cliffhanger in here, but it's not one that you're going to kind of be scrambling to get the next book because it's kind of half resolved within here, but there is kind of room for the story to continue. So I will be reading the second book. I'm really anticipating the second book, especially after reading this one. But yeah, ended up reading this one 4.5 stars. The next one I read is The Nature of Witches, and this is by Rachel Griffin, and this is one again that I've been highly anticipating for quite some time. I have all of Rachel Griffin's books on my physical TBR right now. They're all quite witchy. I believe they're all urban fantasy, so kind of set within this time period, but they're all set around witches, so I think this time of year is the perfect time of year to read them. And this is the first one that was published, I believe, so I wanted to start chronologically and read them kind of in publication order. In this one we follow our main protagonist Clara, and she is currently going to school and trying to kind of hone in her magic. Within this story, the witches have been maintaining climate control for centuries, and essentially there's a few different things happening here where they're not able to control the weather, or they're not getting the weather that they would suspect in certain seasons, and all of the magic system within here is tied to the seasons. So if you're a summer witch, you'll be better at controlling summer weather, a spring witch, you'll be controlling spring weather, and so on and so forth. Now Clara is actually what they call an ever witch, and it means that she kind of moves with the seasons. So when it's spring she has the spring power, when it's summer she has the summer power, and essentially within this she is quite afraid of her power. She's quite hesitant to use it because of certain circumstances that have happened in the past, so she's kind of struggling with that. But she ends up getting this new mentor who is there to kind of encourage her and to help her control her magic so that she doesn't hurt anyone and that she doesn't fear it. And essentially we're just following her journey around that, and for me I was really excited because I do really love the magic system in here. I love that it's tied to the seasons and the way it was kind of explained, but I do think that the start was quite slow for me. I think up until the 40% mark it was quite repetitive. We were really getting that message that the author's trying to convey about climate change, and while I do think that's important, I think it was a little bit on the nose at times, and it probably could have been a little more nuanced than it was within this, but it did make it feel like it was quite a slow start. There was also quite a lot of telling rather than showing, so we weren't kind of brought along for some of the scenarios in terms of like the training and her process and doing things, and for me it just meant I couldn't really connect to the characters as much as I would have liked to. I do think that could also be because this is a YA novel and perhaps I'm just not the right age to be relating to these characters, but I do think if I was given a bit more of that show rather than tell, it may have helped me connect with how the character was feeling and why she was feeling that way. While that is explained, I never really felt it when I was reading this one. That being said, I really liked the writing style in this one. I did enjoy it for the most part, and overall I rated it 3.5 stars, and I do think the relationship in here did end up being pretty cute, even though it wasn't really delved into. I did think it was quite a cute relationship that was in here, so definitely still interested to read the rest of her books. And the next one one I believe is Wild as the Witch, and I've heard a few people saying that that's their favourite, so yeah, I'll be highly anticipating that one, but overall this one was 3.5 stars. So next up was a book I read on my Kindle, and it was An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson, and this one was a dark academia novel, but it also had kind of a subgenre of horror in there as well. I'm not sure if Alexis Henderson is mainly a horror writer. I have some of her other books on kind of my wishlist TBR, but I would say that there was a little bit of a horror element in this one as well. But basically this one we start off with our main protagonist Lennon, who is not having a great time in life. She's definitely at a point in life where she's feeling quite low. She's basically found out some things about her fiance, and at the very opening of the book she is essentially about to take her own life. So firstly, obviously trigger warnings for quite a few things in here: sexual abuse, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and of course suicide. So all in all, she's just in a really low place, but she ends up coming across this phone booth and the phone starts ringing. She gets this call to say that essentially she's being invited to this college called Drayton College, and because of the point she's in life, she thinks, what have I got to lose? She goes there and attends the college. Essentially when she gets there, she's told that she's there because she's special. She has this innate gift for persuasion, and they're going to teach her how to use this and kind of make this a useful tool within normal society. But as she delves into her power and as she delves into this university, she realizes there's quite dark secrets in here. They begin to become uncovered, and she's kind of right in the middle of it as that happens, and the story goes from there. There is a bit of a love interest here with her tutor, and that relationship is a little bit explored throughout. And with this one, I think up until around the 40% mark I was really invested. It was really fast paced. The scenery and the setting was absolutely stunning. It was giving me all the dark academic vibes that I could want. However, after that point I do feel like it dropped off a little bit for me. I wasn't as invested as I had been at the start, and I think a lot of it has to do with the character development and the depth of the characters. Not only the main protagonist but also the characters in and around her. Even though we were kind of going from Lennon's perspective, I didn't really feel like I understood her motivations or her decision making process. I also didn't feel connected to any of the side characters, including the love interest within this one. They were there, but I didn't really feel like I knew them, and they were quite pivotal within this story. I'm quite a character driven reader, so for me it did take quite a lot of that enjoyment away from me. However, the writing style was really beautiful. I do think that in terms of atmosphere building and world building, Alexis Henderson has definitely got talent for that. I did love some of the horror elements. They were really eerie. At times I didn't want to read it at night time because it was really getting me and really building those eerie vibes. And I do think if you're looking for a bit more of a spooky autumn read but you're not quite looking for something that's really scary, this would be a perfect one to read, because if I can handle it, anyone can handle it. I'm an absolute wimp when it comes to these things. So it had that horror element there. It kind of satisfied that side of things, but it wasn't too scary for me. But yeah, I think overall I gave this one 3.5. I think just the character work really let it down for me, but I've seen a lot of people who have said this is absolutely 5 stars. So I think if you connect with the characters, everything else was absolutely perfect, so you probably will enjoy this a little bit more than I did. So next up I read The Scarlet Feel, and this is by Shelby Mahoran, and this is set in the same world as her Serpent and Dove trilogy, and previously I had thought that you could read this without reading that trilogy, but I would definitely recommend reading that before reading this one, because the characters within that play really pivotal roles within this, and there's a lot of contextual scenarios and world building that is done in that trilogy that just wouldn't make sense if you were reading this as a standalone. So if you do see people saying that you can read this on its own, it's probably technically true, but I do think that you would be massively missing out on a lot of the context in this one if you didn't read that trilogy before this. So my recommendation would be to read that first. But essentially in this one we're following our main protagonist Selin, who is an upstanding member of society. She's always been quite straight-laced. She's kind of the perfect daughter, the perfect fiance. She's engaged to a chasseur, who is basically what would have been a witch hunter before, but they essentially keep the society safe from all type of fantastical demons, vampires, werewolves, all those type of things. And she decides at the start of this book she wants some sort of purpose. You know, she wants more than just being a housewife, and she wants to become a chasseur, the same as her fiance. She is quite ridiculed for this. She's told she's too feminine, she's not good enough, she's not tough enough, and because of that she does end up going on this mission on her own and essentially ends up in what's called the darkness, and in this different part of this world that most people haven't explored. And she comes into the hands of this evil vampire who is kind of the leader within this land. And I definitely think this one had kind of Beauty and the Beast vibes. There was definitely an air of that within this. There's ghosts, vampires, all those good things to read about this time of year. And for me it was just really fun. I do think that with Shelby Mahoran's writing and with Serpent and Dove trilogy and with this one as well, they may not be the type of books that I think, oh, this is absolutely 5 stars, you know, I'm gonna think about this all the time, but definitely when I'm reading it I'm extremely entertained. They're really fun. The banter between the characters characters is really good. I feel like the world building is pretty good in here as well in terms of the interactions with the characters. This is romanticy, but for this one there's very little romance in this first story because it's really building that world, building that plot. It's all about the plot that's going around it. There are little crumbs and it's kind of building towards that. There's a bit of a will they won't they as it goes along, but it's definitely not the focus of the book. So I do think, even though I'm calling it kind of romanticy, depending on what you think is romanticy or fantasy romance or however you want to distinguish it, I would say that this is probably a plot first book, and then the romance will come maybe in the later parts of the series. But yeah, I just really loved this. I think it was a really nice spooky book for this time of year. The setting was really spooky, it was quite eerie and dark. As I say, there were ghosts as kind of main characters. I think it was a great autumnal / winter read. Really loved it. Highly anticipating the next book, which is out in, I think it's March or April time next year. I hadn't realised that the next book wasn't out yet, so I'm quite annoyed at myself because this does end on a cliffhanger. But I do think if you're a fan of any type of romantasy, and I hate to say it because everything is compared to it, but if you do like ACOTAR or anything like that, I think this, while it's not the same vibes or story or anything, it does have the same kind of measurement of romance versus plot, so it's probably more of a 50-50 than just being romance within this one. So yeah, highly recommend this one. I ended up giving this one a 4.5. I couldn't put it down. I really enjoyed it, so I couldn't really give it anything less than that. So yeah, definitely recommend this one. And then the last book I read is The Reappearance of Rachel Price, and this is by Holly Jackson. And this one, again, I absolutely love this, and I wasn't too sure what to expect from it. I'm not a huge thriller reader, so maybe take what I say with a pinch of salt, because maybe it was a bit more predictable for avid thriller readers than it would have been for me. But for me, I really enjoyed this, and while there were a few things that I guessed along the way, I do think that it was twisty and turny enough to keep me intrigued. So as the cover says, basically we are following our main protagonist, Belle, in this one, whose mother disappeared 16 years ago. They're doing a documentary about her disappearance at this time. Essentially her mother, Rachel Price, turns up, and it's kind of just figuring out what happened to her. Belle is quite untrusting. She doesn't really believe what Rachel is telling her, and she ends up taking on her own investigation to try and work out exactly what happened and to see if her mother's lying. And yeah, I just really love this. I love the characters in this. I love the banter between the characters. There was a cute little kind of subplot of romance, but I really enjoyed it. I think if you're an avid thriller reader, it may, as I say, be a little bit more predictable because some of the things I did guess quite early on. There is quite clear foreshadowing within this one, but for me it kept me intrigued, kept me interested. I read it within a day, so that probably tells you all you need to know. I do recommend the audiobook for this one. I did listen to the audiobook as well because I was trying to read it in a shorter time frame, and the audiobook was really well done. I thought the narration was really good, and again just kept me intrigued and kept me invested as I was reading along. So yeah, overall really loved this one. 4.5 stars for this one as well, and it's really got me motivated now to read A Good Guard's Guide to Murder because I haven't read that yet. I haven't read that series, and a lot of people say they enjoyed that more than this one, so definitely has me motivated to read that series now as well. Going to attempt to lift these. This is pretty heavy, but I'm not going to lift it. It's not going to get in frame anyway. But that's it. That's everything I read in October. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you enjoyed them, or if you have any recommendations based on how I've enjoyed them as well. As I say, I had a really great reading month. I really enjoyed most of the books that I picked up. So if you do have any recommendations, definitely put those down in the comments below. Let me know what your favourite book was in October. If there's something I should be adding to my TBR. Again, I'm always wanting to build it, so happy to hear any of your recommendations. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I'm posting 2 videos per week, and it's videos like this, so my wrap-ups, book shopping, book hauls, reading vlogs, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!